has grown while the president has been preoccupied with Iraq, where there wasn't a threat.
Mm-hmm. So what's been so interesting here is that John Kerry just actually says that the actual threats were grown in Iraq when the United States troops were stationed, and ever since the U.S. troops were sent to Iraq, these forces have been part of Iraq security forces. Then, ironically, there is increasing amount of attacks and bomb attacks or even terrorist abroad in the nations. It's really comical. Because, before this type of dispatchment, there was almost no relatable assault or attack or security breach that would be so shocking to send down its chills. No. Almost no.
If he'd let the inspectors do their job and go on, we wouldn't have 10 times the numbers of forces in Iraq that we have in Afghanistan chasing Osama bin Laden.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, while Iran is moving towards nuclear weapons, some 37...
So even only if this current sitting president would have actually let the security inspector in general do their job properly without hampering them, then we wouldn't have, this many numbers of troops as we would have actually been struggling as of now. That means that we wouldn't even actually need to send this many, almost 10 times greater amount of troops that we have ever sent to other barrier grounds. Like in Afghanistan, we could have actually finished it with a lesser amount of troops. We never actually would it be in need of sending this whopping amount of numbers of American soldiers to the region. Almost 10 times a greater amount of number than those in Afghanistan. This would be an easy job. Truly an easy job. If and only a president would it be so quick and discreet in his own discretion to let inspector in general perform one's own action. So right now, simultaneously, Iran, one of the greatest threat to U.S. national security, is moving toward the enrichment of nuclear weapons and the proliferation of nuclear ammunitions.
Tons of what they call yellow cake, the stuff they use to make enriched uranium. While they're doing that, North Korea has moved from one bomb maybe, to 4 to 7 bombs.
Mm-hmm. So, when John Kerry is basically emphasizing the very danger, while the United States' hands are tied up with Iraq by pouring our resources and the men and women in uniform, our key enemies, so-called rogue nations, are actually, outsmarting us. Iran is, pretty much close to completing its own enrichment of uranium through the acquisition of this what is called a yellow cake. This creates yellow, powder, cake powder. This dangerous nuclear materials could be almost within reach of their own production. And North Korea, what happens to North Korea? Meanwhile, North Korea is, amping up its capacity to build up more bombs. Once upon a time, it would have probably be able to create one or two, but now it would actually be capable of creating 4 or 5 or even actually more. The additional capacity and capabilities would be added to the North Koreans' bomb production.
For 2 years, the president didn't even engage with North Korea, did nothing at all.
Mm-hmm. You know what? These are, what just actually, what are actually happening. But you know what? Within that 2 years, past 2 years, President actually barely did anything related to North Korea. He just actually deserted North Korea. He has done nothing whatsoever to tame North Korea's nuclear ambition. Because North Korea was out of his scope.
while it was growing more dangerous, despite the warnings of people like former Secretary of Defense William Perry.
You know, North Korea has been getting much, much dangerous. And there was a certain indication from high-ranking military officer, including like the Secretary of Defense William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, who actually, took notice of the danger ever growing inside North Korea.
Who negotiated getting television cameras and inspectors into that reactor. We were safer before.
Who literally negotiated to actually, have camera and inspector from the IAEA into that nuclear development enrichment reactor. That's what has been said. It's really interesting. John Kerry is basically emphasizing the blind side of President George W. Bush's warmongering diplomacy. While the United States is caught up in this scandalous maze called the Iraq War, our key enemies, and I mean not our, but the United States' key enemies are actually ramping up their forces to be much dangerous. They actually they actually live up to their expectation as rogue nations, part of the axis of evil. So ironically, in that 2 years, in that 2 years of scope, President George W. Bush had done nothing. There was no significant or meaningful action taken by this administration to tamp down on North Korea's nuclear ambition. Meanwhile, this dictatorial regime, is getting closer to the perfection of its nuclear powers by actually obtaining the yellow cake, which is really the fundamental resources of the enrichment of uranium. The uranium enrichment is really the shortcut to proliferation of nuclear power for military usage, right? And, that's really Iran, tell the truth. Why have I mixed it up? Iran is in that condition, and North Korea somehow is able to expand its capacity to multiply many different bombs. It just actually has such a mass production capacity within that 2 years scope, or within that 2 years of span, when the George W. Bush administration was completely disinterested in what's happening in North Korea, despite the alert coming from former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who even actually negotiated to have a camera and the inspector from the IAEA to be dispatched inside North Korea's reactor and a factory.
President Bush came to office. Now they have the bombs and we're less safe. So what do?
So, once the President George W. Bush is in office, since he has been the sitting president of the United States, we are less safe. That means our security has been deteriorated. That means that we are no longer safer than before. Our security condition is a far less secure, and
we've got to join with the British and the French, with the Germans who've been involved in their initiative. We've got to lead the world now.
So we've got to actually be involved with initiatives led by French and the British alliance. That means we have to be the leader who's been actually taking the leading position, who's been at the commanding board, who's been in the driver's seat. We should never actually be in the back seat. It's time for us to actually step up to the plate to command the board. Because, ever since President George W. Bush is in charge of this national security, our national security and the defense capacity have been significantly diminished. It's time for us to actually, put our heads together with our global allies, like France and the Great Britain, by actually, joining their initial treatments and treaties and the very first initiative put out by our thoughtful allies. We should actually pay attention to them, and we need to lead them to right direction. We need to actually, gather our thoughts. And the U.S. should actually be at the vanguard of directing this vessel. That's what it is about.
To crack down on proliferation as a whole.
And we all need to, based upon the global corporation, we need to clamp down on this proliferation. That means denuclearization of these rogue nations would be so necessary. But that could only be possibly done in a secure sense, in concert with key allies. That means we should never put our alliance aside. We should never keep this at bay, contingent upon our thick as a thief relations with our friends in the international community. We can truly achieve that prevention of proliferation, which it could have made the entire planet less or safer. That's what it is about.
But the president's been slow to do that even in Russia.
President is even actually slower to do that even in Russia. President is not even actually taking the right action in Russia.
At his pace, it's going to take 13 years.
You know what? If he ever actually calculate this whole scenario based upon his pace would require more than 13 months and years to come. That would be too slow.
To reduce and get a hold of all the loose nuclear material in the former Soviet Union.
To get hold of, all the loosely dissipated nuclear material in the former Soviet Union, it would actually take 13 years. That that many years would it be necessary to completely in control of slackly controlled nuclear materials. That's what it is about.
I've proposed a plan that can capture it and contain it and clean it within 4 years.
I would like to actually present a plan that could completely cleanse the remnants of the old Soviet nuclear weapons within the 4 years, not 13 years. John Kerry's model is much safer and much efficient. He just really wants to offer a plan that would actually bring this genie back in the bottle within the 4 years. Because you remember, it was satellite countries in Russia. They are really kind of nations who've been one way or another affected by the distribution of the nuclear weapons from the old Soviet Union, the USSR. That's what it says. But there should be, certain type of controlling method to take stock of these type of disseminated weapons that are being strewn in the region. We need to take them back. How can we do that? He has a perspective, a vision for that. Based upon his proposition, it would only take 4 years instead of 13 years.
And the president is moving to the creation of our own bunker-busting nuclear weapon. It's very hard to get other countries to give up their weapons when you're busy developing a new one.
And the president also offers, a very scenario that would pivot on developing our own nuclear weapons. This is really the bunker-busting nuclear weapons that would be mighty enough to, shellac any other bunker existing whatsoever nation. There is no other shields that could block out the omnipotence of nuclear weapons. That's really the envisioned viewpoint of President George W. Bush's nuclear weapon. He wants to develop that type of a mighty weapon. But the problem is John Kerry says that if the United States is that much, preoccupied with developing one's own weapon, there is no chance, other nations would give up their own nuclear weapons. They would never actually, go back to denuclearization, where no nuclear weapons would be obtainable. They would never voluntarily abandon their ambitious nuclear goals and projects. Because they've noticed that if the United States can't obtain that, why can't we do that? It's less persuasive. If the United States want to be busy developing such an almighty weapons that might actually, pose another menace to global peace, then no other country would ever like to partake in this denuclearization efforts by robbing dictators of nuclear buttons, right?
One, I'm going to lead the world in the greatest counterproliferation effort, and if we have to get tough with Iran, believe me, we will get tough.
Mm-hmm. If I ever actually become president of the United States, I would like to lead the greatest counter-proliferation efforts. That means, if I ever actually be in charge of the United States, I would like to send a peaceful message, which would actually be number one contributor to denuclearizing and disarming different nations. So we would actually be closer to nuclear-free society. Because, through peaceful negotiations and necessary coercion, those countries are eventually going to minimize their nuclear development. So eventually the disarmament of nuclear weapons would be thinkable. That's what this prospective administration wants to achieve by having John Kerry in power.
Mr. President, minute and a half.
That answer almost made me want to scowl. Keeps talking about let the inspectors do their job. It's naive and dangerous to say that. That's what the Dulfer report showed. He was deceiving the inspectors.
Mm-hmm. He just actually joked about naivety of John Kerry. You might really need to give him kind of grade. Because, if you ever actually invite an inspector from the international organization like IAEA, this type of a notion is very naive. It's not really, a level-headed notion, because that's exactly what happened to Darfur. Darfur, at the time in Sudan, experienced the greatest genocide, almost a sequel to Rwanda. The, global inspectors who are actually dispatched in the region were likely to be fooled because they were actually hiding, or they were actually downsizing the gravity of the situation on the ground in order to actually send them out of their region. Then this would actually involve, human drama. So, if you ever actually think that those, evil countries would play by the rule, then you must be so out of touch with reality. They're going to lie to our authorities, or those neutral inspectors, part of the established international community, and that's not right.
Secondly, of course we've been involved with Iran. I fully understand the threat. And that's why we're doing what he suggested we do. Get the Brits, the Germans, and the French to go make it very clear to the Iranians that if they expect to be a party to the world, to give up their nuclear ambitions.
So what? He actually just defamed his defense policy, saying that, of course, we curious about Iran. Iran has never been neglected by us. We actually, we have been actually doing. This administration has been very much committed to doing what he actually suggested we should do. This is really part of the ongoing engagement with Iran. That's the real reason we actually gather our forces from Brits and Germans and French in order to actually figure out what's happening in Iran. This is a part of the effort to contain and discourage Iran's nuclear ambition. Iran's desire to host its own nuclear power that is actually being monitored from our allies, and we actually know what have our great resources from the global camarades who've been actually working on behalf of the peaceful coalition and the lasting and sustainable peace in global community.
We've been doing that. Let me talk about North Korea. It is naive and dangerous to take a policy that he suggested the other day, which is to have bilateral relations with North Korea. Remember?
And that's exactly what we have been doing, so don't get that wrong. Our administration has been fully following the order suggested by him. So it's not really something that we could not think of, because we've been already practicing that. We've been actually, breathing in and out of this reality indicated by him or recommended by him. But you know what? When it comes to North Korea, it's really impractical and naive idea that we should actually build up on a bilateral and mutual relationship with North Korea.
He's the person who's accusing me of not acting multilaterally. He now wants to take the 6-party talks we have, China, North Korea, South Korea, Russia, Japan, and the United States, and undermine them by having bilateral talks. That's what President Clinton did.
You know what? He's been actually suggesting something really awkward, because he all of a sudden wants us to have a 6-party talk in the diplomatic relations. He wants us to invite North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, and the United States, and Russia. And then he just actually somehow fails to give out a clear clarification on the definition of the bilateral relationship, as if, somehow connotating the disparagement of the bilateral talk that was exactly carried out by the Clinton administration. That was actually from the Clinton administration.
He had bilateral talks with the North Korean, and guess what happened? He didn't honor the agreement. He was enriching uranium. That is a bad policy, of course.
Think about it. He actually wants us to have a 6-party talks when it comes to North Korea. But meanwhile, he's been actually asking us to have a reciprocal and a mutual contact with North Korea in the name of bilateral relationship. But that's exactly what the Clinton administration has done. He's been actually accusing us of disparaging the very significance in the mutual relationship between North Korea and the United States. But the thing is, the Clinton administration didn't actually achieve anything concrete. North Korea has been engaged with its own nuclear proliferation. It's been actually, simply ramping up its efforts to be a nuclear nation. It's nuclear power, nuclear power. That's a really kind of sensational pronunciation that has ever become at the time. Its own nuclear ambition or desire has been just inches away from being realized. That's what it is. That really reflected the very failure of the policy. And why would you want us to repeat the failed track?
Of course we're paying attention to these. It's a great question about Iran. That's why in my speech to the Congress I said there's an axis of evil, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, and we're paying attention to it.
And in terms of the question of attention, we've been greatly engaged with this country. We've been actually paying attention to these nations. That's the reason when I actually made a speech to the Congress during the State of the Union, I actually named these countries as the axis of evil: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And these nations were greatly labeled as the axis of evil and rogue nations. We've been actually literally lapping on what's happening in and outside these bad countries because they are likely to be enemies managing our security.
And we're making progress.
We're going to move on.
And we are making progress. We've got to move on.
Mr. President, with a question for you, and it comes from Daniel Farley.
Daniel Follick, the
Farley.
question from Daniel Follick. Mr. President, it's for
Mr.
you.
President, since we continue to police the world, how do you intend to maintain our military presence without reinstituting a draft?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I hear there's rumors on the internets that we're going to have a draft. We're not going to have a draft.
You know what, Mr. President, I've been actually, constantly hearing this, on the internet, saying that, how can we actually, guarantee the United States would actually be actively being the international police, policing the international hegemony and the international peace. Meanwhile, how can we actually free from the military draft? How can we actually, completely extinguish this, suspicion of conscription? Can we actually not go back to that era? Because that's what happened during the Vietnam War, since we've been actually so devoted to policing the international communities by being a peacekeeper and a gatekeeper. How can we actually make sure that there will be, the military draft requiring compulsory conscription from young men and women in this country, especially young men, just like what we've experienced from past history. That's a lie. On the internet, I've already actually read this kind of arguments. There will be no draft. That's not true. There will be no unwanted military conscription or draft. If you don't want to join the U.S. Army or Air Force or Navy or Coast Guard, it doesn't matter. You don't really need to.
Period. The all-volunteer army works.
Our volunteer army works. That already makes total difference. We don't really need to have a blood transfusion coming from unwanted, involuntary soldiers who never want to be part of the war in the U.S. military forces.
Works particularly when we pay our troops well. It works when we make sure they've got housing. Like,
Especially, this plan works. How come? As long as we pay our soldiers well, and as long as we actually reward them with the decent payment, as long as we guarantee their housing, and we offer so many things to our war veterans coming from war grounds.
like we have done in the last military budgets. And all
Like the one we actually had done with our last military budget.
volunteer army is best suited to fight the new wars of the 21st century.
From his perspective, the voluntary and willing soldiers are the best suited and the best equipped in this 21st and modern day war affairs. It's really different. The actual landscape of warfare has been changed. In this 21st century war era, we do not, in this martial history that hasn't been like no other, we cannot rely on a compulsory conscription. The voluntary workers, as long as they wouldn't be paid well, following from the theory of capitalism, we can actually maintain the best varsity team, eager to go on a battle for this nation.
Which is to be specialized and to find these people as they hide around the world. We don't need mass armies anymore. One of the things we've done is we've taken we begin to transform our military. And by that I mean we're moving troops out of Korea and replacing them with more effective weapons.
So, he says that, it's more like tracing that the terrorists are hiding in the bunkers or caves. It's more like, brain games. The longer, we need mass troops on the grounds or boots deployed and dispatched in the region physically to overview what's happening or fight off our enemies in a vis-a-vis confrontation. That's not, what the 21st century's warfare is about, according to his perspective. For instance, we're gonna eventually pull off all our ground troops from Korea, or we're gonna actually, literally make this peninsula well weaponized with the military intelligence. The top-notch gadgets and equipment would be rolling around in the nation to keep it safe from the invasion of North Korea, right?
We don't need as much manpower on the Korean Peninsula to keep a deterrent.
We don't really need that much, presence of a manpower to keep this peninsula safe on the ground, in soil. No. We can actually, have a much powerful deterrence simply keeping a closer eye on this peninsula 24/7. And this surveillance and intelligence operation will not be done by human beings in presence, in person. Nope. We're going to actually have cutting edge, state of the art technology. And it's really the outsourcing. By allocating jobs to sophisticated equipment.
In Europe, we have massed troops as if the Soviet Union existed and was going to invade into Europe. But those days are over with. And so we're moving troops out of Europe and replacing.
You know what? Even at these days, even actually, in these days, we still actually have a mass troops stationing in Europe, right? But we're going to eventually bring them back home because those days are gone. When Soviet threat is just inches away, just minutes away. This is no longer facing an imminent, clear and imminent danger coming from the Soviet Union. Those days are gone. So it's really kind of funny. We waste our taxpayers' money to feed our soldiers abroad by having them placed in foreign lands like Germany or our key strategic regions or geopolitical beachheads. These type of antiquated strategists are going to face its end, because eventually there will be a smart approach to warfare by replacing these real soldiers on the ground with much well-equipped technology. I'm not lying. I was just really tired. 그래, 이렇게 말하면 되잖아요.